Hello folks, in this short video I'd like to tell you about some of the changes in the Chem 222 lab platform. These changes are mainly to save you some time. I'd also like to remind you about some features in preparing your lab reports, for example. So I'm currently looking at our Chem 222 lab page, and I'm looking under General Resources. Before I go on, I'd like to remind you that for the first lab, we have lab safety, and I once again ask you to complete the student safety agreement. It's the same agreement as last term, so kindly complete that before coming to the lab. Back to the general resources. Please be sure to take a look at the syllabus, although it's essentially the same as last term. I'd like to ask you to take a look at the schedule, so I'm just going to drag the schedule down right here. So if you click on that button, it'll open up the schedule and it lays out the various days. One of the things I'd like to point out to you is, as mentioned in lecture, our midterms are on the day of our labs. So there are no labs on Feb 4th, March 4th, March 25th. But instead, of course, we will have our midterms starting at the 4 p.m. time slot. Of course, I will book a room where we will be more comfortable. In terms of doing the actual lab, you can see that we're starting, for instance, January 14th, Lab 1, and the report for that is typically due for the next lab day, but at 11:59 p.m. Note that we do have, in fact, 8 lab reports, so do keep that in mind. That's a significant number of lab reports. This is in part why I'm changing how much you need to do for each lab report and lab prep. I do encourage you to write up most of the lab before the day that we do the next lab, and then use that day if you have any questions for me so you can clarify. So that's the lab schedule. Next, of course, the lab manual is posted. It's the same lab manual that we used in the first term. Lab book preparation. So I'm going to drag this down. This is an example of how to prepare your lab book. It's going to be a little bit different this term in the sense that I was trying to be consistent with the Kelowna campus. And what the Kelowna campus wanted to do was, under the experimental procedure, have you write a summary, which all of you did and did a good job. And then you were to write up the experimental procedure as you did it in a column, let's say on the left, and then write your observations. Some folks prepared this left-hand side column ahead of time. Some did it while in the lab. I found in general that the quality of this section, the experimental procedure as you did it, was not as good as my last year's lab group, in part because many of you were doing it on the fly, and it's hard to do it on the fly. And so what I've done is I've taken out the fact that I'm asking you to do a summary procedure, and I'm asking you simply to prepare the experimental procedure on the left-hand side before coming to the lab. Write it in passive voice, past tense, with all the appropriate detail that you need to be able to repeat the experiment, concentrations, volumes, this sort of thing, and then leave the right-hand side open for observations. And therefore, the only thing that you need to be writing while you're in the lab are your observations and data. And note, I do ask you to be as clear as possible about writing the data. If you don't have to be writing out procedure, then perhaps you can spend more time writing more clearly what the actual observations and data are. I also ask you to do calculations. Now, sometimes it won't be yield calculations, it'll be other sorts of calculations. So, typically we say yield calculations, but it's whatever calculations are necessary. And to make it as clear as possible what you are calculating, just don't be putting down numbers, okay? So that's a change. And of course, what's also changed associated with that will be the lab book prep rubric. So you may want to be taking a look at that. So lab book prep example, lab book marking rubric. And then in terms of actually doing the report. And so here I have a sample report. It's similar to in the fall, but I've changed things a bit. One, I've taken out the abstract or the summary. And therefore, the only thing you need to do is to have a proper title, a descriptive title, your name, date, and introduction. And I ask you to really be paying attention to the rubric so that you are only addressing those issues that you're asked to address. You will always be asked to indicate the conditions of the reaction. This is not simply repeating what you see in your lab manual. Generally, you'll now be looking at reactions, and it's giving what chemicals were used, what temperature, how long, if there was a workup, this sort of thing. If you're asked to write a mechanism, I ask you to use the draw software, either Marvin Sketch or use the draw software associated with OpenOChem, which is my preference because I think you can do a very nice job using that. You still need to include an experimental approach. So this would be a summary of what you wrote in your lab book. And it should be enough detail that you can repeat the experiment, but not extra data, not observations, unless it's critical to be repeating the experiment. There'll be a results and discussion section, and then finally a reference section. Now, under the results and discussion section, typically you'll be doing a lot of percent yield calculations. Do not show me the calculation here, only the result of the calculation. And you'll also be doing a lot of IR analysis from the ATR-IR. So that's the instrument that we're using, ATR-IR. So please be referring to it as that, the ATR-IR, so that you can contrast this to the lit-IR. Essentially, what you're going to want to be doing is looking at your ATR-IR and looking for the relevant peaks that, for instance, show the transformation from the reactant to the product. If you're asked to include the literature IR, well, then you'll be contrasting that to the literature IR. Note that when we're labeling this, I'm asking you to label it using some sort of presentation program, such as PowerPoint. Make it as professional as possible. When we're labeling this, we're not labeling functional groups per se, unless there's really no other way to be referring to it, but rather the bonds that are involved in making these peaks. Typically, you would not want to label carbon-hydrogen sp3 hybridized unless it's actually really relevant. So, for instance, in this particular reaction, we're going from styrene, which has no carbon-hydrogen sp3 hybridized type of bond, to a structure that does have carbons that are bonded to hydrogen where the carbons are sp3 hybridized. So the fact that in the new IR spectrum, this peak shows up as F is significant, but of course it's not present in our original reactant. So don't be labeling things that are not really relevant or significant. We're looking for those important changes. And then whatever else you're asked to address in the rubric. Now I'm just going to drag over then briefly the rubric here. So you'll see that in the rubric, and of course there'll be a rubric for every report. There is no section now for the summary or abstract. I emphasize when I want you to use a draw editor. I have very specific questions, so please be sure to answer those questions. I remind you in the experimental approach, passive voice, past tense. I remind you in the results and discussion that when you're doing your IR analysis, your goal is to point out differences and how this information supports whether or not you were successful in doing the reaction. And then lastly, I wanted to come back here and just point out that I've actually included 2 sample reports so that you have more examples. And I'm just briefly going to drag and show you this sample report. In this case, for this particular report, that there was an IR analysis. So I'm just going to show that to you here. And again, trying to be as professional as possible in demonstrating the various changes. In this case, the IR analysis was one where we had a ATR-IR and then a literature IR. So we were comparing those two. And then, in fact, there was a GCMS analysis because I ran the samples in the GCMS in Kelowna. Note that if we do use the GC, and we will be using it again, it's the Vernier Mini GC, not a GCMS. It's not hooked up to a mass spectrum. Just want to point that out to you. I hope this short video has helped you think about writing your reports. Please let me know if you have any questions.